We are back, and we are joined now by Dr. Katie J. Wells, geographer at Georgetown University, co-author of Disrupting D.C, The Rise of Uber and the Fall of the City, which she co-wrote alongside do you mind saying the names of your co-authors?
Absolutely. Kafui Atto and Declan Cullen.
Wonderful, wonderful. Katie, thank you so much for coming on the show today.
Great to be here, Emma.
So, Washington, D.C. was the first city that you write about to really formally resist Uber, and 2011 is the year when Uber first approached them, and that's a lot of what your work focuses on here. And you and your co-authored worked with drivers in D.C. in 2016, and that helped kind of shape the narrative here. But before we get to that, I'd love to start from the beginning. From a national perspective, how did Uber explode in the United States? What were the conditions that really led to the takeover of this tech company that, pretends it's a car service but doesn't want any of that oversight that goes with that?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's several important conditions to understand why is it that Uber has become the common sense solution that it is. And one of that has to do with car service, the state of car service regulation in the US, which was really heavily deregulated already by 2011. So the state of chauffeured services or taxis, they weren't great, right? And so you couple that with the Great Recession, which meant that there was a huge number of people struggling with underemployment. And you also have sort of a rush of money that needs to find a place to go from Silicon Valley. You take those conditions, you add in decaying mass transit, and a huge number of people with disposable incomes that had these new machines in their pockets called smartphones. And suddenly you have sort of recipe for the rise of Uber.
Yeah, you mentioned the Great Recession there. I mean, on its face, my initial reaction would be, well, with the recession and all of the layoffs and unemployment, this kind of gig work is a prime to borrow from Naomi Klein, it's a shock doctrine situation where there's a vulnerability that is exploited by this company where people are desperate and need to make money quickly. Is that a fair reading of how Uber began to get a foothold?
Absolutely, exactly. And we actually, sort of use the work of geographer Ruth Wilson Gilmore to talk about Uber as a geographic solution to social and economic crisis, much the way Naomi Klein looks at these sort of shifts in capital and how they shape, the way we respond to them.
Right. It is. I hadn't really thought about it in that way before, but your book does a great job of laying that out, and also being critical of the neoliberal politics that even preceded that moment. Let's go back really to the 1980s and how some of those conditions that were created in cities set the table for this kind of work.
Yeah, that's great. So the reality is Uber didn't cause the problem, right? It just came in and benefited from it. And we want to be clear about that, right? In the 1980s, there was all kinds of federal defunding of cities, right? There was an abandonment of sorts. So you can look at all kinds of cities that didn't have great transit systems, that didn't have great options, especially when it came to racial inequality, didn't options in terms of how they responded to it. And so policymakers really, as well as cities from the 1980s, were really stymied. They had very limited toolboxes in which to address the crises they were facing.
Yeah, I mean, and can you expand on that a little bit? What the political situation was like that caused this disinvestment in cities?
Yeah, I mean, we can actually go back to the beginning, the founding of our country, right? It has been
Great.
Anti-urban. Let's do it, okay? In the founding, 1780s, right? The initial Congress and sort of the get-go of first imaginings of what American life would be like, it was heavily structured against cities, right? Funding for cities was limited. Many of them were underfunded, and many of them still are today. So over the years and decades, there have been periods where cities got funding, like the 1960s. But by the 1980s, that was waning, right? And so there was white flight. There was a huge, we can watch after, the civil rights movement, a huge defunding of things like public pools, golf courses, all kinds of amenities, but also basic ones like grocery stores in all areas of the city, or bus stops or transit.
Right. And is that, how explicitly racist was that effort of disinvestment? We're in this Reagan era too, right? Of capitalist worship, and so pairing that white flight, disinvestment in cities, I think it paints a clear picture of structural racism.
Absolutely. And I think we can look at the work of Kevin Cruz or others who have documented how places in Georgia, for instance, were explicitly racist in their decision to not fund particular urban infrastructure anymore. But I want to be careful to not mark it as something explicitly of Reagan, right? We also have Carter, who was starting to do these public-private partnerships. And so when we saw Uber come in 2011, 2012, we thought, on one hand, maybe this is just a new public-private partnership, but it felt like something different was afoot. And so that's why we think that it marks sort of an exacerbation of this trend.
Right.
It's sort of like,
right. I mean, and it does seem kind of like it's the apex of these dynamics that you speak about here. In your book, you talk about this term technological solutionism, and this being a hallmark or an example of that very dynamic, which is a neoliberal tendency, I would say. Can you expand on that definition for our audience, what that means in practice?
yeah, I mean, it's a very simple thing, and I think I've adhered to it much of my whole life, this idea of technological solutionism, right? It's wonderful to have a washing machine wash your clothes and eliminate the need to hire someone to do that or do that work yourself, right? Technology is supposed to help us live better lives. The reality is, and the danger is, when we allow it to sort of offer up really limited solutions, it inhibits our ability to come up with better options. And so there is a fantasy, certainly in the Obama years, that technology is going to, be our way forward to these really messy structural problems. But technology is still, at the end of the day, a machine, a tiny little limited machine that can only do what its, makers set it to do. So it's embedded with politics and power imbalances. And so technological solutionism is sort of pretending like those power imbalances don't exist.
It's not a coincidence then that so many Obama staffers seem to went and Jay Carney worked for Uber, right? Or did he work for Amazon? No, he worked for Amazon. I forget. Yeah. But there were
David
other.
Plouffe.
Sorry,
David Plouffe.
Yes, right, exactly. I mean, the connection between that era of Democratic Party insider / Obama administration official and the promulgation of Uber, I think that's incredibly notable.
Yeah, and I don't blame them, right? On some level, we found this with the 30 DC area policymakers we followed for 5 years, right? They had sort of the fantasy or the belief that maybe this could help, right? They were not sort of, they did not see the problems of urban life, that they fell for this crappy solution. I don't know, it's hard to blame them, right? But a decade out now, we're ready to blame them.
Right, exactly. So I guess now we'll turn to DC and the efforts in 2011 to resist. What is that story? It ended up obviously not being successful, but the lessons learned, the important takeaways from that fight, and really how it played out.
Yeah, absolutely. So Uber entered DC like it did many cities in late 2011, and it abided by this idea of move quickly and break things, which for Uber meant don't actually follow the law. So it enters illegally in many places.
No other tech platform has ever done that, right? I mean, I've just completely memory hold Theranos, but anyway, sorry, continue.
How about railroads? I mean, we can gold mine. Yeah,
totally. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a long history of an attitude coming out of Silicon Valley that it's better to ask permission or ask forgiveness rather than permission. So when Uber arrived, there was sort of a lone, in our telling, there's a lone regulator who was really worried about its implications for the city. His name was Ron Linton. He was a lifelong regulator, and he set up and starred in his own sting to show the city, actually, we have a huge problem here and we need to figure out what to do about Uber. When he had a driver fined and the car impounded from this Uber drive that he had, sort of videotaped with journalists, he was right to bring it to the fore. What I don't think he imagined happening was sort of a denouncement of regulation as a public good, right? DC was struggling with this question. What should we do about Uber? Should we turn it to actually follow the law, change Uber? Should we change the law to follow Uber? And then there was this other view, which was whatever you do, please don't make the city out to look like anti-tech dinosaurs. And so the debates about Uber were always sort of wrapped up in these questions about urban economic competitiveness and the city's desire to make it look like an inclusive Silicon Valley. And by inclusive, I mean racially diverse.
How does that branding begin to happen? Because the taxi model, right? I mean, I'll take not the United States, New York, for example, because we've had actions by cab drivers, including horrifically a suicide in front of City Hall with a sign taped to him, basically saying, "I blame the government for ruining my livelihood," because in New York City, you have to purchase medallions. It's an investment in your own kind of personal business for a taxi cab. And when Uber just came in and took over, immediately tens of thousands of New Yorkers, I don't have the exact figures, Bradley, maybe you can look up the how many taxi drivers there are in New York City, but their livelihood went away. And was that something similar that was happening in DC? Where was there resistance? Were they being listened to?
Yeah. So, and remember that one suicide was one of at least 8 in a year, right? What we were seeing, right, was workers that were saddled with debt. They were underwater with investment they had made. And I think the parallels to the subprime mortgage crisis were huge in terms of who was getting protected and who wasn't, right? But there were also parallels at that time, right, to thinking about Indian farmers, right, that were committing suicide because their livelihoods had suddenly shifted amongst sort of economic forces. And they had looked to the government, and the government was looking out the window. So in DC, we had a little bit of a different situation. Certainly many, many workers we talked to were saddled with debt as Uber arrived, but it was less intense as that in New York because we did not have the medallion system. And we also had a system where we had about 116 different companies were operating. It wasn't sort of the big cartel model.
Right.
Which, you know, has its pluses and minuses. That the real downside meant that DC taxi workers weren't able to mount a really meaningful challenge to this new intruder.
And how I don't know the racial complexion of DC taxi drivers, but it seems like odd to deploy a racial equity argument in favor of Uber. I don't want to go as far as to say it's deeply cynical, but maybe I will, because it's totally a fig leaf for just cheaper labor practices.
Absolutely. So that was one of the hardest things to figure out, given DC's really radical Black history and sort of strong record of trying to imagine a really full kind of racial justice that included economic justice. It felt so gross to watch Uber as a company come in and tell people, we will solve racial justice when we think of you as a consumer. And by you, I mean sort of Black residents, but not thinking about the fact that it was a Black majority immigrant workforce that it was displacing, right? So Uber on one hand is saying, we're going to address racial justice as long as you think of racial justice just in terms of the consumer, right? Your ability to get a taxi. Because certainly there were complaints that taxis were racist, that they weren't willing to pick up, Black individuals. There was a lot of concern because they were a majority Ethiopian and Eritrean community against the African-American customers. So there were real issues there, right? We don't want to discount that question of hailing while Black. And yet the argument that Uber made and the vision that it and Spike Lee and others have sort of celebrated involves such a really narrow reading of what racial justice looks like. And it doesn't take into consideration this idea of economic justice and workers being people who also need racial justice.
It is deliberately narrow to just focus on one of the more acute experiences that non-white people face when trying to hail a taxi, right? Like that's just such a front-facing example of the deep structural inequalities that lead to systemic racism. And they're using that to disempower a population of workers who were in a more stable position. So it's a really, I would say, thwarting and not terribly honest way to go about business. But it seems like a lot of cities bought it.
Yeah, they did buy it, right? And they bought it because they didn't actually have solutions themselves, right? And there was also the issue of the disability rights community, right? Saying on one hand, taxis are not addressing our needs, right? The city is not addressing our needs. And so maybe Uber will come in and help disabled folks get access to better mobility.
Right.
Now, we haven't found that to be the case, but certainly who doesn't want to hope for a better solution?
Absolutely. And can you talk a bit about how when Uber was trying to disrupt the market, they made their prices cheaper so that people began to use Uber, and that must have been an incredible shock to cab and taxi drivers throughout many cities.
It was, absolutely. It was also a shock to policymakers. They didn't know what to do with it, right? Wait, is this a gift? Are they giving us something? What do they want in return, right? But what we soon found out, what they wanted in return was something that they sort of unveiled in DC, sort of this playbook of clicktivism, right? Where suddenly the company was able to text every single one of its users and say, please let the council, the DC council, our governing body, know that you absolutely do not want the price of your cab, your Uber, to go up.
Right.
And that was a shocking moment. And oh my God, they used the phrase Operation Rolling Thunder, which of course refers to a US military bombing campaign of Vietnam.
Yeah. Yikes.
But that's how they described that was their code name for their first DC battle, using this collectivism model.
I mean, it's a way to imbue yourself with some sense of heroism when you're really just a tech person trying to make a lot of money. Interesting window into the psychology there. So in 2012, DC legislators, I should say, introduced the Uber Amendment. What happened there? Why did it fail? What was that period of time like?
Yeah, so there was a moment in 2012 where DC legislators were concerned with questions about disability rights, and they were floating this question of maybe we should require these new chauffeur services, Uber, Lyft, Sidecar, to uphold the American Disabilities Act and uphold the requirements of all other transportation companies. Now that failed. There was also an attempt in that Uber amendment to require a price floor to try to protect taxi services, to say maybe Uber is a luxury service and we should make sure that it's, at a higher rate. We should also make sure that it's paying a tax to the city that is equal without a chauffeur services. It should share its data so we understand its effects, right? It's really hard for government to regulate something it can't see, which is the case of many of these companies. But all those proposals, right, they flopped. Yeah. And thanks to Operation Rolling Thunder.
Last question. You did spend time with drivers and got some insights into their experience. What would you like our audience to know about what it's like to be a driver for Uber in DC?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we spent about 5 years tracking 40 drivers as they moved on and off the apps. And I think one of the things we learned, especially during the COVID pandemic, is the extent to which Uber is a solution for them, right? One driver, Diana, said to us, Uber helps me at my time of need. And I think what I would want listeners, of the Majority Report to think about with these stories about Uber drivers is what is it that we need to do so that Uber no longer is a solution for these workers, let alone the customers? What kind of a city do we need to build, or what kind of expectations do we need to have so that Uber isn't the pernicious solution that it is?
Right. I mean, it starts with making people's lives more secure. And so they don't have to, on their off time, try to make money by driving for Uber. I mean, it all starts with these propositions that we're seeing undercutting benefits for gig workers, I would say. we have a long way to go, and unfortunately, Uber has a really big head start in what they tried to do.
No, and I think the important thing is these Uber drivers, right? They're in some ways a symptom of the failings of our labor markets, but they're also a harbinger or warning of what we're about to, face.
Absolutely. Dr. Katie J. Wells, the book is Disrupting D.C, The Rise of Uber and the Fall of the City. Really appreciate your time today. We'll put a link to your book that you co-wrote along with Kafuyato and Declan Cullen. I apologize. And we'll put a link to that in the description wherever you're listening to or watching this, and at majority.fm. Thanks so much for your time today.
Thanks, Emma.